Sometimes we find ourselves so broken that even strangers can see the pieces scattered behind us. Sometimes loneliness runs so deep that a man forgets what his own voice sounds like until someone else's pain calls it back to life. In the Montana Territory wilderness, Clara Mitchell stumbles through a deadly blizzard toward a lone mountain cabin. She's been running for days from men who want her dead. When she collapses at Silas Granger's door, this desperate woman makes an offer that shocks the hardened mountain man. "Let me stay here, and I'll give you what no woman can." Silas has lived alone for 12 winters. He's learned that people bring nothing but trouble and heartbreak. But something about Clara's mysterious promise makes him hesitate. What could this woman possibly give him that would be worth risking his carefully guarded solitude? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas Granger stepped back from his cabin door, his weathered hand still gripping the thick wooden handle. The wind howled through the towering pines that surrounded his home like ancient sentinels, their branches heavy with snow that had been falling steadily for 3 days. In all his 12 years on this mountain, he had never encountered another soul during the harsh Montana winters. The isolation was exactly what he had sought when he'd first climbed these treacherous slopes, carrying nothing but his father's hunting knife and a heart full of bitter resolve. The knife now rested on the rough-hewn mantel above his stone fireplace, its worn leather grip polished smooth by generations of Granger hands. His father had carried it through the California gold rush, his grandfather through battles with hostile tribes, and Silas himself had worn it through 4 years of Civil War carnage before trading his uniform for mountain solitude. The blade had seen blood, sweat, and tears, but it had never failed him. Like the mountain itself, it was dependable in ways that people never were. The woman outside his door had stopped speaking, but he could hear her labored breathing through the thick logs. Her words echoed in his mind like a riddle that demanded solving. What could any woman give him that he hadn't already learned to live without? He had food enough for winter, water from the spring that never froze, and wood stacked higher than a man's head. His trap lines provided fresh meat. His small garden had yielded enough preserved vegetables to last until spring, and his books, a precious collection of volumes he'd carried up the mountain one by one over the years, offered all the companionship his mind required. Yet something in her voice had stirred memories he'd spent 12 years trying to bury. The desperation wasn't what moved him. He'd heard plenty of desperate pleas during the war. It was the quiet dignity beneath the fear, the way she'd made her offer like a business proposition, rather than begging for charity. There was strength in her voice, even as her body had clearly reached its limits. Silas moved to the small window beside his door and carefully moved aside the heavy fur that served as a curtain. Through the thick glass, a luxury he'd traded 2 prime beaver pelts for 5 years ago, he could see the woman more clearly. She had fallen to her knees in the snow, but hadn't collapsed entirely. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her clothes, though torn and stained, had once been of good quality. She wasn't a common drifter or a desperate mountain woman. This was someone who had known better circumstances, someone who had chosen to run rather than stay and face whatever had sent her fleeing into the wilderness. Her hands, he noticed, were small but not soft. They moved with purpose as she tried to gather her strength, and when she looked up at his window, her eyes held intelligence alongside the exhaustion. She was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had added years to her features. Most telling of all was the pale band of skin on her ring finger where a wedding band had recently been removed. The wind gusted again, driving snow against the cabin with such force that the walls creaked. No human being could survive a night in this storm without shelter. Silas had seen seasoned trappers freeze to death in weather less severe than what raged beyond his door. Whatever this woman had done, whatever she was running from, leaving her outside would be the same as killing her with his own hands. But letting her inside meant breaking the most important rule he'd lived by since coming to this mountain: trust. No one, depend on no one, and never let anyone close enough to cause the kind of pain that had driven him from civilization in the first place. He thought of Margaret Halloway, the banker's daughter who had promised to wait for him while he served his country. She'd married his business partner 6 months after he'd left for war, taking with her not only his heart, but his share of the profitable freight business they'd built together. He thought of Captain Morrison, who had sworn his men would never be left behind, then ordered Silas's unit into an impossible battle to save his own reputation. He thought of his brother Thomas, who had borrowed against the family land to invest in a surefire scheme, leaving Silas with nothing but debts when he'd finally returned home. People, in his experience, always took more than they gave. They made promises they couldn't keep and broke trust as easily as breathing. The mountain never lied to him. It was harsh but honest, demanding but fair. It gave him exactly what he earned through his own efforts, nothing more, and certainly nothing less. The woman outside stirred again, trying to pull herself to her feet. She would make another attempt to convince him, he realized. She hadn't given up, despite his silence. That persistence spoke of character, even if it also suggested the kind of trouble that followed people who refused to accept defeat gracefully. Silas moved away from the window and added another log to his fire. The flames danced higher, casting warm light across the comfortable interior he'd spent years perfecting. His furniture was simple but well-made, crafted by his own hands from timber he'd felled and seasoned himself. Thick furs covered the floor, and shelves lined the walls, holding his books, his tools, and the few personal items he'd kept from his former life. It was a sanctuary built for one person, designed to meet the needs of a man who had learned that solitude was safer than companionship. The knock came again, softer this time, as if she was conserving her strength. Then her voice, muffled by the wind, but still carrying that strange mixture of desperation and determination. "Please, sir, I know you're listening. I'm not asking for charity, and I'm not looking for an easy life. I've got something valuable to offer in trade for shelter. Something that could change both our lives if you'll just give me the chance to prove it." Silas paused with his hand on the poker, staring into the flames. There was something different about her tone now, more businesslike than pleading. She was negotiating, not begging. It was the voice of someone who had dealt with difficult men before and learned how to appeal to their practical nature rather than their sympathy. "I know about survival," she continued, her words coming in measured bursts, as if she was carefully choosing each one. "I know about medicine, about finding water in dry country, about reading weather patterns and animal signs. I know things about this territory that could keep us both alive and maybe even make us prosperous." The poker grew warm in Silas's grip. Medicine was something he could use. He'd treated his own injuries and illnesses for years with limited supplies and knowledge. And prosperity, well, that was something he'd given up hope of ever seeing again. His traplines provided enough for survival, but little more. The gold rush had passed by this area years ago, though he'd occasionally found small nuggets in the streams that fed down from the higher peaks. But it wasn't her promises that finally made him move toward the door. It was the silence that followed. Them. She had said her piece and was now waiting for his decision without further pleading. That kind of patience in her desperate circumstances suggested a strength of character he hadn't encountered in many people. It reminded him of soldiers who faced death with dignity, knowing that some things were beyond their control, but refusing to compromise their principles even in their final moments. Silas lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured his door and pulled. It opened just wide enough to see her clearly. The storm immediately tried to force its way inside, bringing with it the bite of snow and the howl of wind that spoke of a long night ahead. Clara Mitchell looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of manipulation or false charm. They were the honest eyes of someone who had stated her case and would accept whatever judgment he rendered. She was shivering uncontrollably now, her lips blue with cold, but she maintained her composure as she waited for his response. "What?" "Exactly," Silas said, his voice rusty from disuse. "Are you proposing?" Clara struggled to her feet, using the doorframe for support. Even through her exhaustion, she recognized the importance of this moment. This man held her life in his hands, and she had one chance to convince him that she was worth the risk. "Partnership," she said, her voice steady despite the chattering of her teeth. "I have knowledge that could make us both wealthy, and you have the skills and shelter to keep us both alive long enough to use it." Silas studied her face in the dim light that spilled from his cabin. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her jaw too determined, but there was an intelligence in her eyes that commanded respect. More importantly, she wasn't looking at him with the calculating expression he'd learned to recognize in people who saw him as a mark to be exploited. "What kind of knowledge?" he asked. Clara reached slowly into her coat, moving deliberately to avoid startling him. From an inner pocket she withdrew a small leather pouch, worn smooth from handling. "My husband was a surveyor for the territorial and government. Before he died, he mapped areas of this territory that most people will never see. Areas where the gold runs deeper than anyone imagines." She opened the pouch just enough to show him a glimpse of what lay inside. Hand-drawn maps on waterproof cloth, notes written in a careful script, and what appeared to be samples of rock wrapped in oiled paper. "He's dead," Silas said. It wasn't a question. 3 months ago, shot down in the street in Virginia City by men who wanted what he'd discovered. Clara's voice carried the weight of recent grief, but no self-pity. "I've been running ever since. They know I have his maps and his notes. They know I was with him when he made his most important discoveries." Silas felt the familiar weight of someone else's trouble settling on his shoulders. This was exactly why he'd chosen isolation. Getting involved with other people's problems led to complications, and complications led to the kind of pain he'd spent 12 years learning to avoid. "So you want to use me as protection while you dig for gold that may or may not exist," he said. "I want to offer you a fair partnership in something that definitely exists," Clara corrected. "In exchange for shelter and protection, I'll share everything my husband discovered. Not just the gold locations, but water sources, safe passages through dangerous territory, and seasonal patterns that could make the difference between survival and death in this wilderness." The wind gusted again, and Clara swayed on her feet. Silas made his decision with the same quick judgment that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. He stepped back and pulled the door open wide. "Get inside before you freeze to death," he said. "We can discuss the details where it's warm." Clara stumbled across the threshold, and Silas immediately closed the door behind her, dropping the heavy bar back into place. The cabin felt cramped with another person in it, but the warmth hit her like a physical blow. She stood dripping on his floor, looking around at his sanctuary with obvious appreciation rather than judgment. "Thank you," she said simply. Silas gestured toward the fire. "Get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death. There's a blanket on the chair." He turned his back while she changed, focusing on practical matters to avoid thinking about the complications he'd just invited into his life. He pulled down an extra tin cup and filled it with coffee from the pot that stayed warm beside his fire. When he turned around, Clara was wrapped in his thick wool blanket, her wet clothes hanging over a chair nearby. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, and without the bulky coat, he could see that she was smaller than he'd initially thought, though clearly stronger than her size suggested. She accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin. "I should tell you everything," she said. "If we're going to be partners, you deserve to know exactly what you're getting involved in." Silas poured himself coffee and settled into his usual chair across from her. "Start with your husband, Thomas Mitchell." He worked for the Territorial Survey Office, but he also did private mapping for mining companies and railroad developers. Last spring, he was hired to map potential routes through the northern mountains for a company that was considering a spur line to connect with the main railroad. Clara sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. What he found was more than anyone expected. Not just one or two promising sites, but an entire network of mineral deposits that had been overlooked because they're in areas most people consider inaccessible. And someone killed him for that information. Men who called themselves representatives of the Northern Mountain Development Company. They offered to buy his maps and notes, and when he refused to sell, they took them by force. Clara's voice hardened. Thomas was an honest man. He knew that information belonged to the territorial government, not to private interests who would use it to cheat honest prospectors out of their claims. Silas studied her face. Grief was there, but also anger and determination. This wasn't a woman who would give up easily, which meant the men hunting her probably wouldn't give up easily either. How many are after you? At least 6 that I know of, maybe more. They've been tracking me for 3 months, always staying. Just far enough behind to make me think I might escape, then closing in when I get careless or tired. Clara met his eyes directly. I won't lie to you. Being around me is dangerous, but the information I carry is valuable enough to set us both up for life if we can stay alive long enough to use it properly. Silas considered this. He'd faced worse odds during the war, and the isolation of his mountain home provided advantages that a desperate woman traveling alone couldn't access. His trap lines would give him early warning if strangers entered his territory, and he knew every trail, cave, and hiding place within a day's travel. Show me the maps, he said. Clara opened the leather pouch completely and spread its contents on his table. The maps were indeed drawn on waterproof cloth, executed with the precision of a trained surveyor. They showed areas of the northern Montana territory that Silas recognized, but with details he'd never noticed. Streams were marked with notations about mineral content, rock formations were identified by type and potential value, and elevation. Markers provided exact measurements for areas where most people could only guess. More interesting were the notes written in Clara Mitchell's careful hand. They described seasonal patterns of water flow, animal migration routes that could guide travelers to safety, and weather indicators that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. This wasn't just information about gold. It was a comprehensive guide to surviving and thriving in some of the most challenging territory in the American West. Your husband was thorough, Silas said, studying a detailed drawing of a rock formation he recognized from his own explorations. He was a careful man. He never recorded anything he hadn't verified personally, and he never made claims he couldn't prove. Clara's voice carried pride alongside the grief. These maps represent 2 years of dangerous work in territory where one mistake could be fatal. Silas looked up from the documents. And you were with him during some of this? Most of it. I can read maps and weather signs almost as well as he could. I know how to find water in dry country, how to identify edible plants, and how to treat injuries and illnesses with whatever materials are available. Clara's tone was matter-of-fact rather than boastful. I'm not a helpless woman looking for rescue. I'm offering a genuine partnership with someone who has skills that complement your own. The coffee was warming Silas from the inside, but it was Clara's straightforward approach that was gradually dissolving his resistance. She wasn't trying to manipulate him with tears or feminine helplessness. She was presenting a business proposition based on mutual benefit and honest assessment. Of risk. These men who are hunting you, he said. How close are they? I lost them in the storm, but they won't give up. They have resources and patience, and they know I can't stay ahead of them forever. Clara folded the maps carefully and returned them to the pouch. Eventually, I'll have to make a stand somewhere. I'd rather do it from a position of strength, with a partner I can trust, than alone in the wilderness. Silas stood and walked to his window, looking out at the storm that showed no signs of weakening. His instincts told him that helping this woman would bring trouble down on his head. But those same instincts also told him that she was telling the truth about her situation and her capabilities. And if he was being completely honest with himself, the prospect of wealth was appealing. 12 years of subsistence living had taught him to appreciate security, and the maps he'd just examined showed possibilities he'd never imagined. "Here's what I'm willing to offer," he said, turning back to face her. "You can stay through the winter. In exchange, you'll share whatever knowledge helps us survive and prosper in this territory. Come spring, we'll evaluate our situation and decide whether to continue as partners or go our separate ways." Clara nodded slowly. "And if your pursuers show up before spring, then we deal with them together." Silas met her eyes steadily. "I didn't survive 4 years of war by backing down from fights I couldn't avoid." For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara smiled. It transformed her face completely, revealing the woman she might have been under different circumstances. "Partners, then," she said, extending her hand. Silas shook it, noting the calluses that confirmed her claims about her capabilities. "Partners." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had changed. Silas Granger was no longer alone on his mountain, and Clara Mitchell was no longer running blindly through the wilderness. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The storm raged for 3 more days, giving Clara and Silas time to establish the routines of their unexpected partnership. Clara proved herself useful immediately, taking over the cooking duties, with a competence that transformed Silas's simple meals into something approaching comfort food. She knew how to make the most of preserved vegetables and dried meat, adding wild herbs she'd gathered during her flight to create flavors Silas hadn't tasted in years. More importantly, she respected his space while making herself indispensable. She didn't rearrange his belongings or comment on his Spartan lifestyle. Instead, she found ways to improve their situation without disrupting the patterns he'd spent 12 years establishing. On the second morning, Silas found her examining a photograph that had fallen from her coat pocket during the frantic clothing change of her first night. The image showed Clara in better circumstances, a well-dressed woman standing beside a tall, serious-looking man in front of what appeared to be a surveyor's tent. She was smiling in the photograph, but it was a different smile than the one he'd seen when they'd shaken hands as partners. This one was more reserved, more careful. "Your husband?" Silas asked. Clara nodded, carefully placing the photograph back in her coat. "Thomas was a good man, but he was older than me. Our marriage was more of a practical arrangement than a love match." She didn't elaborate, and Silas didn't press. He understood about practical arrangements and the necessity of making choices based on survival rather than preference. What mattered was that she'd been honest about her situation from the beginning. What surprised him was how naturally she adapted to mountain life. She understood without being told that water had to be conserved, that fuel for the fire was precious, and that noise carried farther in the thin mountain air than it did at lower elevations. When she moved around the cabin, she did so quietly and efficiently, like someone who had learned to be aware of her surroundings at all times. On the third night, he woke to the sound of her crying out in her sleep. Not the self-pitying sobs of someone overwhelmed by circumstances, but the sharp, frightened sounds of someone reliving trauma. He lay still in his bed across the cabin, listening as she fought through whatever nightmare had claimed her, until she finally woke herself with a gasping breath. "Sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "Bad dreams. They'll fade," Silas said quietly. "Eventually." He knew from experience that the mind took time to accept safety after prolonged danger. His own nightmares from the war had taken years to subside, and even now, certain sounds or smells could bring back memories he preferred to leave buried. Clara said nothing more, but he heard her moving quietly around the cabin, probably making tea to settle her nerves. The next morning, she looked tired but determined, and she didn't mention the nightmares again. When the storm finally broke, Silas took Clara outside to show her the full extent of his domain. The snow had transformed the landscape into something almost magical, with every tree and rock covered in pristine white that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. But more importantly, the fresh snow would show any tracks or signs of intruders long before they could get close to the cabin. "Your husband's maps show this area," Silas said, pointing toward a distant ridge that was barely visible through the trees. What did he think of its potential? Clara studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read landscape for both beauty and danger. He thought the streams in that direction showed promise for placer gold, but the real value is probably higher up, where the rock formations suggest deeper deposits. And the access? Difficult in winter, nearly impossible during spring runoff, but manageable in late summer and early fall. Clara turned slowly, taking in the full circle of mountains that surrounded them. This cabin is perfectly positioned, close enough to the promising areas to be useful, far enough from the main trails to avoid unwanted attention. Silas felt a strange pride in her approval. He'd chosen this location based on instinct and the desire for isolation, not any particular strategic thinking. But her expert assessment confirmed that his instincts had been sound. They spent the day checking his trap lines and gathering firewood, tasks that gave Clara a chance to demonstrate her knowledge of wilderness survival. She could read animal tracks in the snow, identify which trees would burn cleanest and hottest, and spot potential hazards in the terrain that might not be obvious to someone less experienced. "You're not what I expected," Silas said as they hauled a load of split wood back toward the cabin. "What did you expect? A helpless city woman who would be more trouble than help." He paused to readjust his grip on the wood he was carrying. "But you move through this country like you belong here." Clara smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. I knew how to work and survive long before I married Thomas. The surveying work just taught me to apply those skills in different territory." That evening, as they sat beside the fire, sharing a meal of rabbit stew and biscuits, Clara had somehow managed to make light and fluffy despite their limited supplies. Silas found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced since his early days on the mountain. Having another person around didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like a return to something he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "Tell me about the men who are hunting you," he said. Clara set down her cup and considered her words carefully. "The leader calls himself Garrett. He's not a common criminal. He dresses well, speaks like an educated man, and carries himself like someone used to being obeyed. But there's something cold about him, something that suggests he's done worse things than stealing maps. And the others? Professional gunmen, I think. They work together like men who've done this kind of thing before." Clara stared into the fire. "When they killed Thomas, it wasn't in the heat of passion or during a robbery gone wrong. It was an execution. They waited until he was alone, called out his name so he would turn around, and shot him down in broad daylight." Silas had seen that kind of killing during the war. Men who could murder in cold blood and sleep soundly afterwards were dangerous in ways that went beyond mere skill with weapons. "How long do we have before they pick up your trail?" "The storm will have covered my tracks, but they know the general direction I was heading. If they're as thorough as they seem to be, they'll check every cabin and settlement in this area." Clara met his eyes. "I'd say 2 weeks, maybe 3 if we're lucky. Then we use that time to prepare." Silas stood and moved to a wooden chest he kept in the corner of the cabin. From it, he withdrew a cloth-wrapped bundle that he hadn't touched in over a year. Inside were his army colt and a well-maintained rifle, along with ammunition and cleaning supplies. Clara watched him check the weapons with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. "You really did serve in the war. 4 years with the 5th Infantry. I know what it's like to be outnumbered and outgunned." Silas looked up from his inspection of the rifle. "But I also know that good preparation and knowledge of the terrain can even the odds considerably." "I've never shot anyone," Clara said quietly. "Hopefully, you won't have to. But if it comes to a fight, I need to know you won't freeze up or panic Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring at the weapons in his hands. When she spoke, her voice carried a determination that surprised him with its intensity. Thomas was a gentleman who never hurt anyone in his life. They shot him down like a dog in the street because he stood between them and what they wanted. She looked up at Silas. "I won't freeze up. When the time comes, I'll do what needs to be done." Silas believed her. There was steel beneath her calm. Exterior, forged by tragedy and hardened by 3 months of running for her life. She might not be a killer, but she was a survivor, and sometimes that was more important. As they prepared for bed, Clara paused beside the chair where her still damp clothes were hanging. From the pocket of her coat, she withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. When she opened it, Silas saw that it was a simple gold wedding band, broken cleanly in half. "I threw it away when I started running," she said softly, "but I kept finding pieces of it in my pack, like it didn't want to stay lost." She held the broken ring for a moment, then placed it on the mantel beside Silas's father's hunting knife. 2 symbols of different kinds of legacy, both belonging to lives that were gone, but not forgotten. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start planning our defense." The next morning brought crystalline mountain air and the kind of silence that only existed. In high country after a heavy snow, Clara woke to find Silas already up, preparing what appeared to be a more substantial breakfast than their usual simple fare. On the table beside his plate was a leather-bound book she hadn't noticed before. "My mother's recipe book," he said, noticing her curious glance. "I thought you might appreciate some variety in our meals." Clara accepted the book with surprise. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in faded brown ink, recording not just recipes, but household remedies, seasonal preserving techniques, and the kind of practical wisdom that farm wives passed down through generations. "She died when I was 16. Silas said, settling into his chair with his coffee. "Before the war, before I came to the mountains, I carried this with me through everything that came after." The admission represented a level of personal sharing that went beyond their practical partnership. Clara understood that he was offering her a glimpse into the man he'd been before isolation and disappointment had shaped him into the person she'd met 3 days ago. "She must have been a remarkable woman," Clara said, carefully turning the yellowed pages. "These remedies, some of them are quite sophisticated." "She had to be. We lived 20 miles from the nearest town, and doctors were scarce even there. When someone got sick or injured, she was usually the only help available." Clara found a recipe for wild berry preserves, and another for a cough syrup made from pine needles and honey. There were instructions for treating wounds with herbs that grew wild in the mountains, and detailed notes about which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided. "This could be incredibly useful," she said. "Thomas's notes are mostly about geology and mineral deposits, but this covers survival from a completely different angle." They spent the morning combining their knowledge, with Clara sharing what she remembered from her husband's maps and Silas adding his own 12 years of experience in the territory. Together, they created a more complete picture of their surroundings than either could have managed alone. By afternoon, they had established a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Clara took over the domestic duties, cooking, mending, and organizing their supplies, while Silas focused on security preparations and maintenance of their equipment. But unlike the traditional division of labor she'd known in her marriage, this arrangement felt like a genuine partnership where both contributed according to their strengths. "You're different than I expected too," Clara said, as they worked together to prepare jerky from a deer Silas had brought down the week before. "Different? How? Gentler? More patient?" Clara sliced the meat into strips with practiced efficiency. "I thought mountain men were supposed to be rough and antisocial." Silas smiled, an expression that was becoming more frequent as the days passed. "Maybe I'm just out of practice at being antisocial." The comment was light, but Clara heard something deeper in it. This man had chosen isolation, not because he preferred it, but because it had seemed safer than risking further disappointment. She understood that choice better than he probably realized. That evening, as they sat beside the fire, with Clara mending one of his shirts and Silas cleaning his weapons, the conversation turned to more personal topics. "What made you marry a man you didn't love?" Silas asked. Clara's needle paused in its work. "Security. Thomas offered me a stable life and a chance to see something of the world beyond Nebraska farmland. It seemed like a reasonable trade at the time. And was it? For a while, Thomas was kind to me and the work was interesting. I learned things I never would have learned otherwise." Clara resumed her sewing, "But it wasn't what I'd dreamed of. When I was young." "What had you dreamed of?" Clara was quiet for so long that Silas thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a wistfulness that made her seem younger than her years. "Adventure, I suppose. Romance. A love so strong it would be worth any sacrifice." She laughed softly. "Foolish dreams for a farm girl with no prospects and no dowry." "Not foolish," Silas said, "just young." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between them and the wind whistling softly through the pines outside. Finally, Clara set aside her mending and looked across at him. "What about you? Was there ever anyone who made you think about something other than solitude?" Silas considered deflecting the question, but Clara had been honest with him about her circumstances. She deserved the same honesty in return. "Margaret Halloway, the banker's daughter in St. Louis. We were engaged before I left for the war." He set down the rifle he'd been cleaning. "She promised to wait for me. Instead, she married my business partner and used my share of our freight company as her dowry." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." Silas met her eyes. "But it taught me that people rarely mean what they say when the stakes are high." Clara nodded, understanding. "Thomas taught me that security isn't the same thing as happiness. Some lessons take time to learn properly." The next morning brought the first test of their developing partnership. While checking his trap lines, Silas found signs that someone had been moving through the area during the night. Not the random tracks of a lost traveler, but the purposeful movement of people who knew how to minimize their trail. "2 men, maybe 3, he said when he returned to the cabin. "They stayed well clear of the obvious approaches, but they were definitely scouting our position." Clara felt her stomach tighten with familiar fear, but also a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. "How long do we have?" "They'll want to observe us for a day or 2 before making their move. Professional hunters don't rush into unknown situations." Silas moved to his weapons cache. "But we should assume they could move against us at any time." Clara surprised herself by feeling calmer than she'd expected. 3 months of running had taught her that action was easier to handle than uncertainty. "What do you need me to do?" They spent the day preparing their defenses. Silas showed Clara how to load and fire both the rifle and the pistol, though he hoped she'd never need to use either. More importantly, he taught her the signals they would use to communicate if they had to separate, and made sure she knew the locations of his emergency caches of food and ammunition. "If something happens to me," he said, "don't try to be a hero. Take what supplies you can carry and head for the high country. There are caves up there where you could hide until spring if necessary." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Clara said firmly. "Maybe not. But if it does, I need to know you won't do anything foolish trying to help me." Clara met his eyes steadily. "I promise not to do anything foolish. But I'm not promising to abandon you if you're in trouble." That night, they took turns keeping watch. During her shift, Clara found herself thinking about how much her life had changed in less than a week. She was still in danger, still being hunted by dangerous men, but she no longer felt alone and helpless. Having a partner, having Silas, had changed everything about her situation. When he relieved her for the second watch, their hands touched briefly as he took the rifle from her. The contact was brief and practical, but it sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire they kept burning in the cabin. "Clara," he said softly. "Yes? Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past few days have been..." He paused, searching for words. They've reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten. Clara understood. The loneliness she'd carried through her marriage to Thomas was different from the isolation Silas had chosen, but both had left them hungry for the kind of connection they'd found in their unexpected partnership. For me too, she said. They were. Standing close enough that she could see the warmth in his eyes, could feel the solid presence of him in the cold mountain air. For a moment, the danger surrounding them seemed far away, less important than the growing awareness of what was developing between them. Then a branch snapped in the forest beyond the cabin, and they both tensed, the intimate moment replaced by immediate alertness. It might be nothing, Silas whispered, but his hands were already moving to check his weapons. Clara nodded and moved silently to her position near the window. Whatever was coming, they would face it together, and somehow that made all the difference. The sound in the forest turned out to be nothing more than a branch heavy with snow, finally surrendering to gravity. But it served as a stark reminder of how quickly their situation could change. The next morning, Clara made a decision that would alter the foundation of their partnership. "There's something else I need to tell you," she said, as they shared breakfast in the pre-dawn darkness. "Something I should have mentioned from the beginning." Silas set down his coffee cup, instantly alert. "What is it?" Clara retrieved her leather pouch and spread its contents on the table, but this time she unfolded a section of cloth he hadn't seen before. Hidden beneath the other maps was a detailed drawing that took his breath away, a hand-drawn map showing an intricate network of underground passages and hidden valleys that connected to known mining areas throughout the Northern Territory. "This isn't just about surface gold deposits," Clara said quietly. "Thomas discovered something much bigger. These mountains are honeycombed with natural caves and abandoned mine shafts that create a hidden highway through some of the most inaccessible country in the territory." Silas studied the map with growing amazement. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just the locations of the passages, but their connections to water sources, their accessibility during different seasons, and most remarkably, notations indicating where previous miners had struck significant deposits before abandoning their claims. "Why would anyone abandon profitable claims?" he asked. "Because they didn't understand what they'd found. Most of these early prospectors were looking for easy surface gold. When the placer deposits played out, they moved on, never realizing that the real wealth was deeper in the mountain." Clara traced a route on the map with her finger. "Thomas figured out that these aren't separate deposits. They're all part of the same massive vein system that runs through the entire range." Silas felt his understanding of their situation shift dramatically. "This isn't just valuable, it's revolutionary. Information like this could redirect the entire future of mining in this territory, which is exactly why the men hunting me are willing to kill for it." Clara's voice carried a weight of responsibility that explained much about her behavior over the past week. "This isn't just about personal wealth. Whoever controls this information could control the economic development of half the Montana Territory." The implications were staggering. Railroad routes, town development, territorial boundaries, all of these decisions were being made based on incomplete information about the true mineral wealth of the region. Thomas Mitchell's surveys represented knowledge that could shift the balance of power between competing interests across the entire American West. "The Northern Mountain Development Company," Silas said, beginning to understand the scope of what they faced. "They're not just another mining outfit," Thomas thought. They represented Eastern financial interests, possibly even foreign investors looking to gain control of American mineral resources. Clara folded the map carefully. When he refused to sell his information, he wasn't just protecting his professional integrity, he was protecting American interests. Silas stood and moved to the window, processing this new information. The men hunting Clara weren't just criminals seeking easy profit. They were agents of a larger conspiracy that had implications far beyond personal survival. "This changes everything," he said. Does it change your willingness to help me? Silas turned back to face her. The woman sitting at his table was no longer just a desperate fugitive seeking shelter. She was the guardian of information that could affect the future of the entire territory, and she'd trusted him with knowledge that made them both targets of forces more powerful than simple bounty hunters. It makes helping you more important, not less, he said. But it also means we're facing enemies with resources we hadn't considered. Clara nodded. I know it's a lot to ask. You're not asking, Silas interrupted. You're offering me the chance to be part of something that matters, to do something worthwhile, instead of just hiding from the world. The admission surprised him with its honesty. For 12 years, he'd told himself that isolation was a choice rather than a retreat. But Clara's trust in him had awakened something he'd thought was dead, the desire to be part of something larger than his own survival. Thomas died, believing this information should serve the public good rather than private profit, Clara said. If we can get it to the right people, territorial officials, honest mining engineers, government surveyors, it could ensure that development happens in a way that benefits everyone rather than just a few powerful interests. And if we can't, then the conspiracy succeeds, and these mountains become the private preserve of whoever has the most money and the fewest scruples. Silas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, but unlike the burdens he'd carried during the war, this one felt purposeful rather than crushing. He was being given the chance to fight for something he believed in, alongside someone who'd already proven her courage and integrity. Show me the routes, he said, returning to the table. If we're going to move this information safely, I need to understand all our options. They spent the morning studying the maps in detail, with Clara explaining the seasonal challenges of each route, and Silas adding his knowledge of the terrain and potential hazards. What emerged was a picture of possibilities that neither could have developed alone. Escape routes that avoided known trails, hidden caches where supplies could be stored, and alternative paths that could be used if their primary plans failed. More importantly, they began to develop contingency plans that went beyond simple survival. If they could reach certain locations marked on Thomas's maps, they could gather additional evidence to support his findings. If they could access some of the abandoned mining sites, they might be able to retrieve samples that would prove the scope of the mineral deposits. We're not just running anymore, Clara said as they completed their planning. We're taking the initiative. It's a dangerous strategy, Silas warned. Active resistance draws more attention than passive hiding. But it also gives us the chance to control our own fate instead of just reacting to whatever our enemies do next. That afternoon, they began implementing their new strategy. Using information from the maps, they located the entrance to a cave system that connected to passages Thomas had explored during his surveys. The entrance was hidden behind a screen of thick evergreens and required climbing skills that would discourage casual discovery. Inside, they found evidence of Thomas's previous visits, survey stakes marked with his initials, and most remarkably, a cache of additional supplies he'd left for emergency use. Among these were more detailed notes about specific mining sites, samples of ore that confirmed his theories about the interconnected vein system, and most valuable of all, copies of official territorial documents that suggested the Northern Mountain Development Company had been operating without proper legal authority. Thomas was building a case, Clara said, examining the documents by lamplight. He wasn't just mapping mineral deposits, he was documenting illegal activity. Silas studied a letter that appeared to be correspondence between territorial officials and company representatives. The language was carefully diplomatic, but the implications were clear. The company had been making claims and conducting operations in areas where they had no legal right to be working. This is why they killed him, Silas said. He wasn't just a surveyor who'd found valuable mineral deposits. He was a witness to systematic fraud on a territorial scale. Clara's face was grim as she sorted through the additional documents. "And I'm the only person left who knows where to find the evidence that could expose the entire operation." They gathered everything they could carry and carefully concealed the rest for future retrieval. As they made their way back through the cave system to the surface, both were quiet, processing the full implications of what they'd discovered. The partnership that had begun as a simple arrangement for mutual survival had evolved into something much more significant. They were no longer just two people trying to stay alive. They were custodians of information that could affect the future of the American West. "There's no going back now," Clara said, as they emerged from the cave into the late afternoon sunlight. "There hasn't been since the moment you knocked on my door," Silas replied. "We just understand the stakes better now." As they made their way back toward the cabin, following a route that avoided the obvious trails, Silas found himself studying Clara with new appreciation. She moved through the difficult terrain with confidence, her eyes constantly scanning for potential threats or opportunities. This wasn't a woman who needed protecting, this was a partner who brought strength and intelligence to their alliance. "Clara," he said, as they paused to rest near an outcropping that provided a clear view of the approaches to his cabin. "Yes? When this is over, when we've dealt with the men hunting you and gotten this information to the right people, what then?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mountains that stretched endlessly in all directions. "I don't know," she said finally. "For 3 months I've been focused entirely on surviving from one day to the next. I haven't allowed myself to think about what comes after. Maybe it's time to start thinking about it." She looked at him then, and he saw something in her expression that made his heart beat faster. It was the same awareness he'd been feeling, the recognition that their partnership had become something deeper than either had expected. "What about you?" she asked. "This mountain, this isolation, is it still what you want?" Silas considered the question seriously. A week ago, he would have answered without hesitation that solitude was all he needed or wanted. But Clara's presence had reminded him of aspects of life he'd forgotten, conversation that challenged his thinking, companionship that enhanced rather than diminished his daily experiences, and most surprisingly, the possibility of trust that went both ways. "I thought it was," he said, "but I'm beginning to think I was confusing safety with satisfaction." Their eyes met and held, and in that moment, both understood that their partnership had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever happened in the days ahead, they would face it not just as allies, but as people who had found something valuable in each other. The sound of distant horses broke the spell, and both immediately dropped low behind the rocks that sheltered them. Through his telescope, Silas could see 3 riders moving along the valley floor below, following the same general route Clara had taken when she'd first arrived at his cabin. "It's them," Clara whispered, her face pale but determined. Silas studied the riders carefully. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of professional hunters, and their leader, a well-dressed man riding a superior horse, matched Clara's description of Garrett perfectly. "They've found our general area," Silas said, "but they don't know our exact location yet." "How long do we have?" "Not long. They'll find the cabin by tomorrow, maybe sooner." Clara reached for the maps and documents they'd retrieved from the cave. "Then we need to move these to a safer location tonight." Silas nodded, but his mind was already working on a different problem. Running might preserve the information and keep them alive, but it wouldn't solve the underlying threat. As long as Garrett and his men were free to operate, other innocent people would die, and the conspiracy Thomas Mitchell had died trying to expose would continue. "There's another option," he said quietly. Clara looked at him with sudden understanding. "You want to make a stand. I want to end this. If we keep running, they'll eventually catch us. And even if they don't, someone else will pay the price for what we know." Clara was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options. When she spoke, her voice carried the same determination he'd heard when she'd first offered him partnership. "Then we make our stand, but we do it smart, and we do it together." As they watched the riders disappear into the forest below, both knew that their time of preparation was ending. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine not just their personal survival, but the fate of the information they carried and the future it represented. The mountains around them were beautiful and silent, but Silas and Clara were no longer alone in the wilderness. The outside world had found them, and there would be no more hiding from the consequences of the choices they'd made. That evening, as they prepared for what might be their final night of peace, Clara made a discovery that changed everything she thought she knew about her partner. While gathering additional supplies from Silas's storage areas, she found a wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards near his bed. The box had been carefully concealed, but her search for ammunition had led her to the hiding place. "Silas," she called softly. When he joined her, she gestured toward the box without touching it. "I was looking for the extra cartridges you mentioned, and I found this. I didn't open it." Silas stared at the box for a long moment, then knelt and carefully lifted it from its hiding place. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a military medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, along with official documents and a daguerreotype of a younger Silas in dress uniform. Clara's breath caught. "Silas, this is something I tried to forget," he said quietly, but without the bitterness she might have expected. "I was awarded this after the Battle of Antietam. My unit was cut off behind enemy lines, and I managed to get most of them out alive." Clara studied the citation that accompanied the medal. The language was formal and restrained, but it described acts of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. Silas had not only saved his unit, he had single-handedly held off a Confederate advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive, then led a tactical withdrawal that saved hundreds of lives. "Why did you hide this?" she asked. "Because being a hero didn't protect me from betrayal when I came home. If anything, it made people expect more from me than I was able to give." Silas carefully rewrapped the medal. "I thought if I forgot about the man I used to be, it would hurt less when people disappointed me." Clara understood. Military honors meant nothing to the fiancé who had married his business partner, or to the brother who had gambled away the family land. The recognition of his courage had become a reminder of his naivety in trusting others. "But you're not that same man now," she said gently. "And I'm not Margaret Halloway or any of the other people who failed to see your worth." Silas looked up at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "No," he said, "you're not." The admission hung between them, carrying weight that went far beyond the simple words. They both understood that they were acknowledging feelings that had grown from partnership into something deeper and more complex. "Clara," Silas said, rising to face her, "if we don't survive tomorrow, we will survive," she interrupted. "But if you're trying to tell me that you care about me, I already know, just as you know that I care about you." They were standing, close enough that Clara could see the wariness in his eyes, giving way to something warmer and more hopeful. When he reached out to touch her face, she didn't pull away. "I never expected this," he said softly. "Neither did I, but I'm not sorry. It happened." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, tentative, as if both were afraid that too much intensity might break the spell of their growing connection. But as Clara responded, her hands finding their way to his shoulders, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing held too long in check. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them seemed charged with new possibilities. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Clara said, "I want you to know that these past days with you have been the happiest I've known since I was a girl." "For me too," Silas admitted. "I thought I'd lost the capacity for this kind of feeling." They spent the evening making final preparations for the confrontation they knew was coming, but the work was different now, charged with the awareness of what they had found in each other. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of people who had learned to trust completely, but also with the heightened attention of lovers who were newly aware of each other's physical presence. As full darkness fell, they implemented their defensive strategy. The cabin would serve as their stronghold, but they had prepared multiple fallback positions using the terrain advantages Silas knew and the escape routes Thomas's maps had revealed. If forced to retreat, they could disappear into the cave system they'd explored earlier, and from there access trails that would take them to safety. More importantly, they had hidden copies of the most crucial documents in 3 separate locations. Even if they were killed or captured, the evidence of the conspiracy would eventually be found by someone who could act on it. "Are you frightened?" Clara asked as they settled in for their watch rotation. "Yes," Silas said honestly, "but not of dying. I'm frightened of losing what we've found together before we've had the chance to explore what it might become." Clara reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. "Then we'll have to make sure that doesn't happen." The night passed quietly, with no sign of immediate threat, but both knew that Garrett and his men were out there, probably waiting for dawn to begin their final approach. Professional hunters would want good light for what they planned to do. During the pre-dawn hours, as Clara kept watch and Silas caught a few hours of rest, she found herself thinking about the strange chain of events that had brought them together. 3 months ago, she had been a surveyor's widow with no prospects beyond whatever security she could find in her knowledge of her dead husband's work. Now she was a partner in something that felt like the kind of adventure she'd dreamed of. As a young woman, allied with a man who represented everything she hadn't known she wanted, the irony wasn't lost on her. She had married Thomas for security and found herself living a careful, circumscribed life that prioritized safety over passion. Now, facing mortal danger alongside Silas, she felt more alive and more hopeful than she had in years. When Silas woke to take his turn at watch, Clara was still lost in these thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "About how strange life is. A week ago, I thought my best hope was to disappear completely, to find some place where I could hide from the world and live quietly until I grew old." Clara smiled. "Now I find myself planning to fight for something that matters, alongside someone who makes me remember what it feels like to have dreams instead of just plans for survival." Silas understood. His own dreams had been buried so deep beneath disappointment and caution that he'd forgotten they existed. But Clara's courage in trusting him had awakened possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. "When this is over," he said, "I'd like to see what those dreams might look like." So would I. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees around the cabin, both knew that the time for planning and preparation was ending. Whatever came next would test not only their tactical skills and determination, but the strength of the bond they had forged in the crucible of shared danger and growing love. They checked their weapons one final time, reviewed their signals and fallback positions, and took up their positions to wait for whatever Garrett and his men would bring with the morning light. Outside, the forest was waking to another day, but it would not be a day like any other. By sunset, the conspiracy that had killed Thomas Mitchell would either be exposed or triumphant, and Silas and Clara would either be dead or free to build the future they had discovered in each other's arms. The waiting was almost over. The attack came at sunrise, but not in the way Silas and Clara had expected. Instead of a direct assault on the cabin, Garrett's voice called out from the forest, requesting a parley under a white flag. "Mrs. Mitchell." The voice was cultured and confident, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe we have matters to discuss that would be better resolved through conversation than violence." Silas and Clara exchanged glances from their positions inside the cabin. This wasn't the behavior of simple bounty hunters or even professional killers. This was the approach of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "What kind of conversation?" Clara called back, her voice steady despite the tension she felt. "The kind that might save both our lives and serve the interests of justice." There was a pause. Then Garrett continued. I think you'll find that the situation is considerably more complex than you've been led to believe. From his position at the window, Silas could see movement in the trees. At least 3 men, positioned to cover all approaches to the cabin. But they weren't advancing, and their leader's willingness to talk suggested they had something other than immediate violence in mind. "What do you propose?" Clara asked. "A meeting. You and your protector, myself and one of my associates. Midway, between the cabin and the tree line, where we can speak without weapons drawn." Clara looked to Silas for his assessment. His military experience told him this could be a trap, but his tactical mind also recognized that Garrett could have simply attacked at dawn if his goal was to kill them quickly. The fact that he wanted to talk suggested either confidence in his position or genuine complication in his motives. "We need to hear what he has to say," Clara said quietly. "If there's any chance of resolving this without bloodshed, there's also a chance it's a trap designed to get us away from our defenses," Silas warned. "I know, but we can't hide in here forever, and if he has information that changes our understanding of the situation—" Silas nodded reluctantly. Clara was right. Their defensive position was strong, but not impregnable, and their supplies wouldn't last indefinitely. If there was a chance to end the standoff through negotiation, they had to explore it. "Agreed," Clara called out, "but I want to see your men withdraw to a distance of 50 yards before we come out." "Acceptable. You'll do the same with any allies you may have positioned in the area." The comment was clearly a probe to determine if they had help nearby, but Clara answered honestly, "It's just the 2 of us." "Very well. Give us 5 minutes to reposition, then we'll meet in the clearing." Silas and Clara used the time to prepare for multiple possibilities. They went armed, but not aggressively so, and Silas made sure Clara knew exactly where to move if the meeting turned violent. Most importantly, they agreed on signals that would allow them to communicate without words. Garrett proved to be exactly what Clara had described, a well-dressed man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He was accompanied by a younger man who had the alert posture of a professional soldier but carried himself with more discipline than a common gunman. "Mrs. Mitchell," Garrett said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed genuine. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I regret the circumstances that have brought us together." "You regret shooting down my husband in the street?" Clara's voice carried controlled anger. "I regret that your husband's death was necessary," Garrett corrected. "But I think you'll find that the situation was more complicated than you've been told." He reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid triggering a violent response, and withdrew a leather folder. From it, he produced a silver badge that caught the morning sunlight. "My name is Samuel Garrett, and I'm a federal marshal operating under special commission from the territorial governor. Your husband was killed not because he refused to sell information to mining interests, but because he was part of a conspiracy to defraud the federal government of mineral rights worth millions of dollars." Clara stared at the badge, her mind struggling to process this revelation. "That's impossible. Thomas was an honest man. Your husband was working with corrupt territorial officials to falsify survey reports and create fraudulent mining claims," Garrett continued. "The Northern Mountain Development Company you've been told about doesn't exist. It was a fiction created to provide cover for a much larger scheme involving stolen federal land and forged government documents." Silas studied Garrett's face, looking for signs of deception. The marshal met his gaze steadily, showing no indication of the nervousness or overconfidence that usually accompanied elaborate lies. "Prove it," Silas said. Garrett nodded and produced additional documents from his folder. "These are copies of correspondence between your husband and known criminals in the Territorial Land Office. They detail a plan to create false survey reports that would allow private individuals to file claims on federal land that had never been properly surveyed or designated for private ownership." Clara examined the documents with growing horror. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, and the content described exactly the kind of systematic fraud Garrett was describing. But the details were all wrong. The places mentioned, the people involved, even the dates didn't match her memories of Thomas's actual work. "These are forgeries," she said finally. "The locations are wrong, and the timeline doesn't match Thomas's actual movements during the periods mentioned." Garrett smiled, but it wasn't the expression of someone whose deception had been uncovered. It was the smile of someone whose expectations had been confirmed. "Exactly right, Mrs. Mitchell. These documents are indeed forgeries. Forgeries that your husband discovered and was preparing to expose when he was killed." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your husband was working for me. He was a federal agent, Mrs. Mitchell, investigating the very conspiracy he's been accused of participating in." Garrett's voice softened. "He was killed not because he was corrupt, but because he was getting too close to exposing the real criminals." Clara sank onto a fallen log, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Everything she thought she understood about Thomas's death, about the men hunting her, about the significance of the information she carried, had just been turned upside down. "The maps," she said weakly, "the mineral surveys are genuine, and they're precisely why the real conspirators want them so badly. Your husband's legitimate surveys revealed the true extent of mineral wealth in areas where fraudulent claims have already been filed. That information could prove that millions of dollars in federal land has been stolen through forged documents and bribed officials." Silas moved protectively closer to Clara, his mind racing through the implications of this revelation. "If Thomas was working for you, why have you been hunting his widow for 3 months?" "Because I needed to determine whether Mrs. Mitchell was part of her husband's cover story or genuinely ignorant of his real mission. And because the real conspirators have been hunting her just as hard as we have, making it difficult to approach her safely." Garrett gestured toward his companion. "Agent Morrison here has been tracking the actual criminal organization for 6 months. They're led by Territorial Land Commissioner James Whitmore and include at least 3 federal judges, 2 territorial legislators, and a network of fraudulent mining companies that exist only on paper." Clara looked up at Garrett with growing understanding. "The men who killed Thomas were agents of Commissioner Whitmore, acting to eliminate a federal investigator who had gotten too close to the truth." Garrett's expression hardened. "They're the same men who have been tracking you, Mrs. Mitchell, though they're not the only ones. Whitmore's organization includes some very dangerous individuals who won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens their operation." "Then why didn't you identify yourself sooner?" Silas demanded. "Why let her think she was being hunted by the people her husband died trying to protect?" "Because until this morning, I wasn't certain she could be trusted. Thomas Mitchell's cover was so deep that even I wasn't sure whether his marriage was genuine or part of his legend. I needed to observe her behavior, to see how she used the information she carried and who she trusted with it." Garrett looked directly at Clara. "Your actions over the past week have convinced me that you're exactly who you appear to be. An innocent woman caught up in something much larger and more dangerous than a simple mining dispute." Clara felt the world shifting around her, all her assumptions and beliefs rearranging themselves into new patterns. Thomas hadn't been the gentle, honest surveyor she'd thought she'd married. He'd been a federal agent, living a carefully constructed lie, using their marriage as cover for an investigation that had ultimately cost him his life. "Did he care about me at all?" she asked quietly. "Or was everything between us just part of his mission?" Garrett's expression softened. "I can't speak to your husband's feelings, Mrs. Mitchell, but I can tell you that when we discussed the dangers of his assignment, the only thing he seemed truly concerned about was ensuring your safety. If something happened to him, a man doesn't worry about protecting a wife who's just part of his cover story." The revelation was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. Thomas might have been living a lie, but his concern for her safety had been real. And now she understood why he'd been so careful to teach her wilderness survival skills, why he'd insisted She memorized details about his survey routes and why he'd hidden so many supplies in remote locations. He'd been preparing her to survive without him, knowing that his work might eventually put them both in mortal danger. "What happens now?" Silas asked. "Now we work together to finish what Thomas Mitchell started," Garrett said. "The information Mrs. Mitchell carries is the key to exposing the entire conspiracy and recovering millions of dollars in stolen federal land. But first, we have to deal with the immediate threat." He turned to scan the forest around them. "Whitmore's men are closing in on this location. They'll be here within hours, and they won't be interested in conversation. If we're going to preserve the evidence and get Mrs. Mitchell to safety, we need to move quickly." Clara stood, her resolve returning as she processed this new understanding of her situation. She was no longer just a widow fleeing her husband's killers. She was the guardian of evidence that could bring justice for Thomas's death and prevent further crimes against the federal government. "What do you need us to do?" she asked. Garrett smiled, and this time the expression was genuine and warming. "Exactly what you've been doing, Mrs. Mitchell. Survive, protect the information, and trust the right people when they offer to help." He looked at Silas. "Your military record speaks highly of your tactical abilities, Mr. Granger. We could use that expertise in the confrontation that's coming." The morning sun was climbing higher, and all four of them could feel the pressure of time running out. Somewhere in the forest around them, the real enemies were approaching, and the final confrontation was about to begin. The alliance between Clara, Silas, and the federal marshals transformed their tactical situation completely, but it also elevated the stakes to a level none of them had fully anticipated. As they returned to the cabin to gather essential supplies and prepare for the approaching confrontation, Agent Morrison produced detailed intelligence that painted a sobering picture of what they faced. "Whitmore's organization has at least 8 men in the immediate area," Morrison reported, spreading a hand-drawn map on Silas's table. "They're being led by a man named Crane, ex-military, cashiered out of the army for brutality toward civilians. He's got orders to recover the survey documents at any cost and eliminate all witnesses." Silas studied the map, noting the positions Morrison had marked. "They're trying to encircle us, but they're moving too slowly. Professional soldiers would have had us surrounded an hour ago. Crane's being cautious because he knows there are federal agents in the area," Garrett explained. "He can't afford to attack legitimate law enforcement officers without absolute certainty about their involvement." Clara gathered Thomas's survey equipment from its hiding place, a precision transit and compass set that had been among his most prized possessions. Hidden within the wooden case were additional documents that even she hadn't known existed, sealed in waterproof containers and concealed within false compartments that Thomas had constructed himself. "He really was preparing for this possibility," she said, examining the hidden materials. "Everything I thought was just thoroughness was actually precaution." The documents included detailed records of fraudulent land transactions, photographs of forged government seals, and most damning of all, financial records that traced the flow of money from the stolen land sales through a network of banks and investment companies that reached all the way to Washington, D.C. "This isn't just territorial corruption," Garrett said, reviewing the evidence. "This is a conspiracy that involves federal officials at the highest levels of government, which explains why they're willing to kill federal agents to protect it." Morrison added grimly. Silas felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders as he assessed their tactical situation. 4 people, well armed but outnumbered 2 to 1, facing professional killers on terrain that offered both advantages and disadvantages. The cabin provided good defensive cover, but it could also become a trap if they were completely surrounded. "We have options," he said, outlining his analysis. "We can make a stand here and force them to come to us, or we can use the cave system to relocate to a position that gives us better long-term advantages." "What do you recommend?" Garrett asked. "Depends on our objectives. If we just want to survive and escape, we move to the caves and disappear into the high country. If we want to end this permanently, we make our stand here and force a decisive confrontation. Clara looked up from Thomas's documents. What would Thomas have wanted? He would have wanted the truth to come out, and he would have wanted the people responsible for his death to face justice, Garrett said. But he also would have wanted you to survive, to see that justice done. Then we make our stand, Clara said with quiet determination. But we do it in a way that ensures these documents reach the right people regardless of what happens to us. They spent the next hour implementing a plan that combined defensive tactics with information security. Multiple copies of the most crucial documents were hidden in separate locations, with detailed instructions for their recovery, left in places where honest investigators would eventually find them. The original survey equipment and its hidden contents were prepared for transport, ready to be moved quickly if retreat became necessary. Most importantly, they established communication protocols that would allow them to coordinate their defense, while maintaining flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. Silas's military experience proved invaluable in creating overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions that would allow them to inflict maximum casualties on any attackers. There's something else we need to consider, Morrison said as they completed their preparations. Crane has orders to take Mrs. Mitchell alive if possible. He needs her to authenticate the documents and reveal any additional hiding places. That gives us a tactical advantage, but it also means they'll be more willing to take risks to capture rather than kill her. Clara absorbed this information without flinching. They can try to take me alive, but they won't succeed. I'd rather do than help them complete what they started. It won't come to that, Silas said firmly, but privately he was already calculating the alternatives they would face if the situation became desperate. As the morning progressed, they began to see signs of the approaching enemy, distant movement in the forest, the absence of normal wildlife sounds, and most tellingly, the behavior of Silas's horses, which became increasingly nervous as unfamiliar scents reached them on the mountain air. They're getting ready to move, Garrett observed, checking his weapons one final time. Probably waiting for afternoon, when the angle of the sun will work in their favor. Clara found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken over the past week. 7 days ago, she had been a desperate fugitive with no one to trust and no hope beyond simple survival. Now she was part of a team fighting for justice, allied with a man she loved and respected, preparing to confront the forces that had destroyed her former life. "Are you frightened?" Silas asked quietly, echoing the question she had posed to him the night before. "Yes," Clara said, "but not of dying. I'm frightened of failing, of letting Thomas's sacrifice be meaningless, of allowing these criminals to escape justice." "That won't happen," Silas assured her. "Whatever else occurs today, the truth will survive. We've made sure of that." As they settled into their final positions, Clara realized that she felt calmer than she had since the day Thomas was killed. For 3 months, she had been running from her problems, reacting to threats she didn't fully understand, driven by fear and desperation. Now she was taking action based on knowledge and purpose, supported by people she trusted completely. "Silas," she said as they checked their communication signals one last time, "yes, whatever happens today, I want you to know that meeting you was worth everything that led to it. If I had to go through all of this again to end up fighting beside you, I would do it willingly." Silas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Clara, you are the best thing that has happened to me in more years than I care to count. And when this is over, I intend to spend considerable time showing you exactly what you mean to me." Their final preparations complete, the 4 defenders settled in to wait for the attack they knew was coming. Outside, the forest had grown ominously, quiet, and the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Somewhere among the trees, armed men were preparing to kill them for the information they carried and the justice they represented. But Clara and Silas were no longer the desperate fugitives who had first found each other a week ago. They were partners in every sense of the word, lovers, allies, and fellow guardians of truth that was bigger than their own survival. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with courage drawn from their growing love and determination, forged in the crucible of shared purpose. The waiting was almost over, and the final battle for Thomas Mitchell's legacy was about to begin. Through his telescope, Silas could see movement at the edge of the clearing. "Here they come," he said quietly. Clara checked her rifle one final time and settled into her shooting position. "Let them come," she said. "We're ready." And they were. After days of running, hiding, and reacting to others' initiatives, they were finally prepared to take control of their own fate. The men approaching through the forest thought they were hunting a frightened woman and her protector, but they were actually walking into a trap set by people who had found something worth fighting for. The final confrontation was about to begin. The attack began with a deception that almost worked. Instead of the frontal assault they had prepared for, Crane's men sent forward a single rider carrying what appeared to be a white flag. The man rode boldly into the clearing, calling out that he carried a message from territorial authorities. "Don't trust it," Silas warned, but he held his fire as the rider approached the cabin. "Mrs. Mitchell," the man called out, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy to defraud the federal government. Surrender yourself, and you'll be treated according to law." From her position at the side window, Clara could see that the man was well dressed and carried himself with official bearing. If she hadn't learned the truth about the conspiracy from Marshal Garrett, she might have been tempted to surrender. "Show me the warrant," she called back. The rider reached into his coat, but instead of producing documents, his hand emerged with a pistol. He fired toward the cabin while spurring his horse to retreat, the shot splintering wood inches from where Clara crouched. Silas's rifle spoke immediately, the heavy bullet taking the false messenger from his saddle before he could escape. The man hit the ground hard and didn't move again. "So much for negotiation," Marshal Garrett observed grimly from his position covering the rear approach. The real attack came immediately after, coordinated assault from 3 directions that showed professional military planning. Crane had positioned his men to attack the cabin simultaneously from the front and both flanks, while keeping a reserve force ready to cut off any attempt at retreat. From his position at the front window, Silas had a clear view of 4 men advancing through the trees, using military tactics to provide cover for each other as they moved. These weren't the desperate criminals Clara had been imagining during her months of flight. These were experienced soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. "They're good," he admitted to Clara, who was covering the left side of the cabin. "But they're not expecting federal marshals." As if responding to his words, Agent Morrison's voice cut through the sound of gunfire from behind the cabin. "Federal agents, you are surrounded and ordered to surrender." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The advancing men hesitated, clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected presence of legitimate law enforcement. In that moment of confusion, Silas acted. His first shot dropped the lead attacker, a bearded man who had been directing the others' movements. His second shot wounded another, sending the man sprawling behind a fallen log. The coordinated assault began to falter as the remaining attackers realized they were facing more than they had bargained for. But Crane had anticipated the possibility of resistance, and he had prepared accordingly. From somewhere in the forest came the distinctive whistle of a signal mirror, flashing in the sunlight. Not a random reflection, but a deliberate communication sent in the precise pattern Silas remembered from his own military service. "They're calling for reinforcements," he told Clara grimly. Through the trees, they could see additional movement as more armed men moved into position. What had begun as an 8-man operation was expanding rapidly, and the defenders suddenly found themselves facing odds that were becoming increasingly unfavorable. "We need to move," Marshal Garrett called from his position. "They're trying to box us in completely." Silas made a quick assessment of their tactical situation. The cabin provided good cover, but it was also becoming a trap. If Crane's men managed to surround them completely, they would be pinned down with no escape route and limited supplies for a prolonged siege. "Clara, grab the essential documents," he ordered. "We're relocating to the secondary position." Clara moved quickly to gather Thomas's survey equipment and the most crucial papers, her movements efficient despite the bullets that were now striking the cabin walls with increasing frequency. She had faced death before during her months of running, but this was different. This was active combat, and the stakes involved more than just her personal survival. "Ready," she said, shouldering the pack that contained their most valuable evidence. Silas produced the signal mirror he had kept since his military days, catching the afternoon sunlight and flashing a complex pattern toward the distant ridge where he had allies positioned. The response came immediately. 3 bright flashes that confirmed his message had been received and understood. "What was that about?" Marshal Garrett asked as they prepared to move. "Insurance," Silas replied. "I may have been a hermit for 12 years, but I wasn't completely alone up here. There are other mountain men who owe me favors, and I called in those debts this morning." The revelation that Silas had additional allies in the area changed the tactical equations significantly. Crane's men had planned their attack based on the assumption that they were facing 4 isolated defenders. The presence of additional fighters, positioned in the high country and familiar with the terrain, would complicate their strategy considerably. The breakout from the cabin required precise timing and coordination. Agent Morrison created a diversion by firing rapidly from the rear window, drawing attention to his position while the others prepared to move. When Silas gave the signal, all 4 defenders moved simultaneously toward their predetermined escape route. Clara found herself running through terrain that would have been impossible for her to navigate just a week earlier, but her time with Silas had taught her to read the mountain landscape and move efficiently through difficult country. Behind them, shouts and gunfire indicated that their retreat had been discovered, but the head start they had gained through surprise gave them the time they needed to reach their secondary position. The cave entrance Silas had selected was hidden behind a screen of thick evergreens and required climbing skills that would slow any pursuit. More importantly, it connected to the underground passage system that Thomas's surveys had mapped, giving them multiple escape routes if their new position became untenable. "Excellent choice," Marshal Garrett observed as they settled into defensive positions within the cave mouth. "We can hold this approach indefinitely if necessary." From their elevated position, they had clear fields of fire covering all the likely approaches to their location. Any attackers would have to expose themselves to reach the cave, and the rocky terrain provided minimal cover for an advancing force. But Silas was already thinking beyond simple defense. The signal mirror communications with his mountain allies had established a coordinated plan that went beyond merely surviving Crane's attack. If executed properly, they could turn the tables on their pursuers and end the threat permanently. "In about 10 minutes," he told the others, "this situation is going to change dramatically." Clara looked at him with curiosity, but before she could ask for details, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the forest below them. It was coming from behind Crane's position, and the pattern suggested a coordinated attack on the rear elements of his force. "Your allies?" Marshal Garrett asked. "3 of the best marksmen in the territory, men who know these mountains better than anyone alive," Silas confirmed. "They're hitting Crane's reserve force and cutting off his retreat routes." The sounds of battle below them intensified as Crane's carefully planned operation began to unravel. Caught between the defenders in the cave and the unexpected attack from the high country, his men found themselves fighting on multiple fronts against opponents who had every advantage of terrain and position. Clara watched the developing battle with amazement. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from being a hunted fugitive to being part of a coordinated military operation that was systematically destroying the forces that had been pursuing her for months. "Is it over?" she asked as the gunfire below began to diminish. "Not yet," Silas said grimly. "Crane himself is still out there, and he's the most dangerous of them all. He won't give up easily, and he'll try to take hostages if he thinks it will. Help him escape." As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the forest below, educated, authoritative, and filled with the kind of cold determination that marked truly dangerous men. "Marshal Garrett, I know you're up there, and I know you can hear me. I have a proposition that might interest you." Granger's voice echoed off the rocky walls around their position, carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. From their elevated position in the cave mouth, the defenders could see him standing in partial cover behind a large boulder, close enough to communicate, but positioned to retreat quickly if necessary. "What kind of proposition?" Marshal Garrett called back, though his expression made it clear he had no intention of negotiating with the man who had killed Thomas Mitchell. "The kind that acknowledges reality," Crane replied. "You've won this particular engagement, Marshal. But the organization I represent has resources that extend far beyond what you've seen here today. Kill me, and you'll simply face a larger, more determined response within the month." Clara felt anger surge through her at the casual arrogance in the man's voice. This was the person who had ordered her husband's execution, who had hunted her across half the territory, who represented everything corrupt and evil about the conspiracy they were fighting. "What are you offering?" Garrett asked, though Silas could see the marshal's rifle trained steadily on Crane's position. "Information, names, dates, financial records, everything you need to roll up the entire network from the territorial level all the way to Washington." Crane's voice carried the confidence of a man who believed he held valuable cards. "In exchange, I want safe passage out of the territory and a head start before you begin your arrests." "Why would you betray your own organization?" Agent Morrison called out. "Because I'm a pragmatist, Agent Morrison. The operation has been compromised, and continuing to fight is no longer profitable. Better to cut my losses and start over somewhere, else than to die for other men's greed." Clara looked at Silas and saw her own skepticism reflected in his expression. Men like Crane didn't survive in their profession by making deals that left them vulnerable to future retaliation. If he was offering to expose the conspiracy, it was because he had already calculated an advantage that the marshals couldn't see. "Don't trust him," she said quietly. "Thomas learned not to trust people who found betrayal profitable." Silas nodded, but he was studying the tactical situation with growing concern. Crane was visible, but his position suggested he had backup nearby. That the defenders couldn't see, the fact that he was willing to expose himself for this conversation, meant he felt confident about his chances of survival, regardless of how the negotiation proceeded. "I need proof of good faith," Marshal Garrett called down. "Give me one significant piece of information to demonstrate the value of what you're offering." "Very well." Crane's voice carried a note of satisfaction that sent warning signals through Silas's mind. "The Territorial Land Commissioner you're looking for, James Whitmore, isn't the head of this operation. He's a middleman taking orders from Federal Judge Harrison Blackwood, who has been using his position to legitimize fraudulent land transactions for the past 3 years. The information was indeed significant, representing exactly the kind of high-level corruption that had made Thomas Mitchell's investigation so dangerous. But Clara noticed something in Crane's tone that troubled her. He had delivered the information too easily, as if he had been prepared for exactly this question. "He's stalling," she realized. "He's waiting for something." Silas came to the same conclusion at almost the same moment. His military experience had taught him to recognize when an enemy was playing for time, and Crane's willingness to negotiate, despite his tactical disadvantage, suggested he expected his situation to improve shortly. "Garrett," Silas called quietly, "we need to end this conversation and move." He's got something planned. But before the marshal could respond, the sound that Crane had been waiting for echoed through the forest. The distant whistle of a train approaching along the Valley Railroad, line that ran 20 miles to the south. It was barely audible at their elevation, but Crane's reaction made it clear that the sound had significance he had been anticipating. "Unfortunately, gentlemen, our time for negotiation has just expired," Crane called out, his voice now carrying open mockery. "You see, I took the liberty of sending a telegram to certain interested parties before beginning today's operation. Federal reinforcements are on their way, but they're carrying orders that might not be exactly what you expect." The implications hit Marshal Garrett immediately. If corrupt federal officials were sending armed response teams with orders to eliminate the investigation, the defenders might find themselves fighting legitimate federal agents who believed they were suppressing a criminal conspiracy rather than exposing one. "Judge Blackwood has issued federal warrants for your arrest," Crane continued. "Within the hour, you'll be facing a squad of federal marshals with orders to bring you in dead or alive on charges of murdering territorial officials and interfering with legitimate mining operations." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. Understanding once again. Just when they thought they had gained the upper hand, Crane had revealed another layer of the conspiracy that threatened to turn their victory into defeat. "That's impossible," Agent Morrison protested. "Federal marshals don't take orders from territorial judges." "They do when those judges have friends in Washington who can make their careers disappear," Crane replied. "Judge Blackwood has been very careful to cultivate relationships with people who matter in the federal justice system." Silas assessed their new situation with the quick calculation that had kept him alive through 4 years of war. If Crane was telling the truth, they had perhaps an hour before federal agents arrived with orders to arrest or kill them. Fighting legitimate law enforcement officers wasn't an option, but surrender would mean the destruction of all the evidence they had gathered and the permanent success of the conspiracy. "We need proof," Marshal Garrett called down. "Show me these." "Warrants you claim exist." Crane reached into his coat and produced a leather document case, holding it up where they could see it clearly. "Federal arrest warrants for Samuel Garrett, Thomas Morrison, Clara Mitchell, and Silas Granger, issued by Judge Harrison Blackwood on charges of conspiracy, murder, and theft of federal property." Even at their distance, the documents looked authentic, bearing official seals and signatures that appeared genuine. If Crane had managed to obtain legitimate federal warrants through corrupt channels, their situation had just become desperate in ways none of them had anticipated. "There is another option," Crane continued, his voice now carrying the tone of a man who held all the advantages. "Surrender Mrs. Mitchell and the documents she carries, and I can guarantee that the federal agents will find no evidence of wrongdoing. When they arrive, you'll be free to go, and everyone can return to their normal lives." Clara felt herself becoming the center of attention as all eyes turned to her. In the space of a few minutes, she had gone from being a partner in their victory to being the sacrifice that might save the others from federal prosecution. "No," she said firmly before anyone could speak. "I won't be used to legitimize Thomas's murder or cover up the crimes we've uncovered." "Clara," Marshal Garrett said gently, "if those warrants are genuine, then we fight," she interrupted. "We take our evidence to higher authorities, we expose the corruption, and we make sure that Thomas's death means something. I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering to the people who killed him." Silas felt pride surge through him at Clara's courage, but his tactical mind was already working on alternatives. Fighting federal agents was impossible, but there might be other ways to preserve their mission while avoiding a confrontation that would destroy everything they had worked for. He produced his signal mirror once again, catching the afternoon light and sending a complex message toward the high country where his allies were positioned. The response came quickly, 3 long flashes followed by 2 short ones, confirming that his message had been received and understood. "What are you doing?" Clara asked. "Buying us time and creating options," Silas replied. My friends up there have skills that go beyond marksmanship. If anyone can verify whether those federal agents are legitimate or not, it's them." From below, Crane's voice carried a note of growing impatience. "You have 15 minutes to decide, Marshal Garrett. After that, I withdraw my offer, and you'll have to explain your situation to the federal agents without any assistance from me." Clara reached for the fabric from her old wedding dress, which she had kept among her few possessions. Tearing off a piece of the white cloth, she tied it to the end of her rifle barrel and held it up where Crane could see it. "I have a counter-offer," she called down. "Single combat. You and me, winner takes everything." The suggestion was so unexpected that even Silas stared at her in amazement. But Clara's expression was calm and determined, and her voice carried the authority of someone who had thought through all the implications of what she was proposing. "Clara, what are you doing?" Silas asked urgently. "Ending this," she replied. "One way or another." Clara's proposal of single combat stunned everyone into momentary silence. Even Crane, who had been controlling the conversation through superior knowledge and careful manipulation, seemed taken aback by the unexpected offer. "That's insane," Silas said urgently. "Clara, he's a professional killer. And I'm a woman who has nothing left to lose," Clara replied calmly, "but everything to gain by ending this properly." From below, Crane's laughter echoed off the rocky walls around them. "Mrs. Mitchell, I appreciate the dramatic gesture, but I'm not in the habit of fighting duels with ladies." "Then you're a coward as well as a murderer," Clara called back, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "Thomas Mitchell was unarmed when your men shot him down. At least give his widow the chance he never had." The insult had its intended effect. Crane's voice, when it came again, carried an edge of anger that hadn't been there before. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Single combat, weapons of your choice. Winner takes everything. If you kill me, you get all the documents and evidence, and these men go free. If I kill you, your organization leaves us alone permanently, and we take our evidence to federal authorities you can't control." Silas grabbed Clara's arm. "I won't let you do this. It's suicide." Clara looked at him with eyes that held love, but also unshakable determination. "It's justice, Silas, and it's the only way to end this without more good people dying." She reached into her pack and withdrew a simple wooden ring that Silas had been carving during their quiet evenings in the cabin. It was rough and unfinished, but it represented everything they had found in each other during their brief time together. "If something happens to me," she said, placing the ring in his hand, "remember that you gave me something I never thought I'd have, the chance to fight for something that mattered alongside someone I loved." Before Silas could protest further, Clara was moving toward the cave entrance, her rifle held ready but not aggressively positioned. "What's your answer, Crane? Are you brave enough to face one woman in honest combat?" The challenge hung in the air for a long moment before Crane responded. "Very well, Mrs. Mitchell. Rifles, 50 paces, at the count of 10. Winner takes everything, as you said." "Clara, don't do this," Marshal Garrett pleaded. "We can find another. A way. There is no other way," Clara said firmly. "If those federal warrants are real, you'll be arrested before you can expose the conspiracy. If they're fake, more people will die fighting agents who think they're doing their duty. This ends it cleanly." As Clara made her way down toward the clearing where the duel would take place, Silas felt his world narrowing to a single point of desperate focus. Everything they had found together, everything they had built in their brief partnership, was about to be risked on her ability to outfight a professional killer. But as he watched her move with confident precision through the rocky terrain, he realized that Clara had changed fundamentally from the desperate woman who had collapsed at his door a week ago. She had found something worth fighting for, and more importantly, she had found the courage to fight for it, regardless of the personal cost. The duel itself was anticlimactic in its brevity. Clara and Crane took their positions at opposite ends. Of the clearing, their rifles held ready. Agent Morrison began the count, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. 1, 2, 3. On the count of 7, Crane broke the rules of their agreement, bringing his rifle up early, in an attempt to gain an unfair advantage. But Clara had been expecting treachery. She had learned to read men like Crane during her months of running, and she was ready for his betrayal. Her shot took him cleanly through the chest before his rifle could complete its swing toward her. Crane dropped to the ground without firing, his weapon falling harmlessly beside him. Clara stood for a moment in the clearing, smoke still rising from her rifle barrel, then walked calmly to where Crane lay dying. She knelt beside him, not in triumph, but in the kind of solemn recognition that marked the end of a long and difficult journey. "Thomas is avenged," she said quietly, then stood and walked back toward the cave where Silas was waiting for her. The federal agents that Crane had threatened them with never materialized. As Silas's mountain allies confirmed through their reconnaissance, the men approaching along the railroad line were indeed legitimate federal marshals, but they carried orders to assist in the investigation rather than suppress it. Judge Blackwood's influence, it turned out, extended far enough to forge convincing documents, but not far enough to corrupt an entire federal operation. Within 3 days, the evidence that Clara and Thomas had preserved led to arrests that reached from the territorial capital all the way to Washington, D.C. The conspiracy that had cost Thomas Mitchell his life was exposed completely, and the stolen federal lands were returned to legitimate government control. But for Clara and Silas, the most important resolution was much more personal. Standing together on the porch of his cabin as autumn settled over the Montana mountains, they planned a future that neither could have imagined when they had first become reluctant partners. "The territorial governor has offered you a position as chief territorial surveyor," Silas said, reading from an official letter that had arrived with the morning mail. "And the Federal Marshal Service has offered you a commission based on your military record and your actions during this investigation," Clara replied, indicating her own correspondence. They looked at each other and smiled, both thinking the same thing. "Neither of us wants those jobs," Silas said. "Neither of us needs those jobs," Clara agreed. Thomas Mitchell's mineral surveys had indeed revealed deposits of extraordinary value, and Clara's legal claim to her husband's work ensured that she would never want for financial security. But, more importantly, they had discovered that the mountains themselves offered everything they needed for a life built on their own terms. "I have a counter-proposal," Clara said, producing the wooden ring that Silas had been carving during their time together. It was finished now, polished smooth and carved with intricate patterns that represented the mountain peaks surrounding their home. "What kind of proposal?" Silas asked, though his smile suggested he already knew what she had in mind. "The kind that involves a permanent partnership," Clara said, holding up the ring, "with someone who showed me that trust and love are still possible, even after betrayal and loss." Silas took the ring and knelt in the autumn sunshine that streamed across the cabin porch. "Clara Mitchell, will you marry me and help me build a life that's worthy of what we've found together?" "Yes," Clara said, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had fought for the right to choose her own future. "Yes, I will." As Silas slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. She had begun as a desperate fugitive, fleeing from a past that seemed to offer nothing but death and betrayal. She was ending as a woman who had chosen love, partnership, and the kind of adventure she had dreamed of as a young girl. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and challenging, offering a future that would demand everything. They had learned about survival, trust, and love, but they would face that future together, as partners in every sense of the word, guardians of each other and of the untamed land they had chosen to call home. Thomas Mitchell's legacy lived on not just in the justice that had been served, but in the love story that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. And in the years that followed, as Clara and Silas built their life together in the high country they both loved, they would remember that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from surveying the land, but from surveying the human heart and finding it capable of healing, growth, and the kind of love that can transform even the most unlikely circumstances into the foundation of enduring happiness. The mountain man and the woman who had begged to stay had found something that neither maps nor surveys could measure. They had found home in each other, and that was a treasure that no conspiracy could steal and no betrayal could diminish.